The next item is item number 7, application for certificate of appropriateness in the Borough of Manhattan, docket number 15-2143, block 611, lot 38, 130 7th Avenue South in the Greenwich Village Historic District, a commercial building designed by Scacchetti and Siegel and built in 1937. This is an application to demolish the existing building and construct a new building, and this was last presented on January 21st.
It's like making cake, you know, what they did.
Good morning, Commissioners. John Graham of Landmark staff. Since you saw this proposal in January for work at a property on the west side of 7th Avenue South between Charles Street and West 10th Street, the project owners and the architects have made a number of changes in response to the comments made at the January meeting, including lowering the building by 1 floor and redesigning the facade with an emphasis on masonry. This was the project that you saw in January, and here is the revised proposal with the original proposal outlined in red. The architects are here today to talk about the changes to this proposal, and Harry Kendall is going to start.
We're going to pause for just a minute because people seem to be fleeing the room.
Demand attention. Hearing open, over here. Motion second.
Harry.
Hello, Commissioners. I'm Harry Kendall with BKSK Architects. I'll give a brief introduction and turn it over to my partner, George Schiefedecker. When we brought this building to the Commission in the last public hearing, we heard two primary points. One, that the building seemed to inexplicably emphasize its verticality, and that it was both seemed too tall and was a bit too tall. Secondly, that although it wasn't fenestrated too overly fenestrated, it gave the appearance of too much glass, and that we should look better at the context and find a way to weave it a bit more into the brick and brownstone context. So we're bringing before you a building, we heard you loud and clear, we're bringing before you a building that is 1 full story lower, set back more on the sides, and also a weave of 2 masonry types, brick and brownstone, to emphasize its continuity with the context. Actually go back. In the last hearing, Commissioner Bland called this building extremely clever, maybe too clever. We'd like to, we come to you and we hope to transition from clever to thoughtful. But I want to underscore that our level of ambition is not diminished, and that our close reading of the context is hopefully became very much evident in this design. That in 1919, when 7th Avenue South was cut through the existing fabric, and other avenues were cut through around this time, that a number of fascinating sites that took a long time to get built, trapezoidal, and in this case really triangular. This is one of the few sites that comes right to a point. The healing process has been intermittent. It provides us a record, I think a historically important record, of successive eras and how they've dealt with the reestablishment of the avenue wall in this case. And we are undiminished in our belief that a scale difference, it's become somewhat slight. In fact, around the corner in this block, the buildings are, for all intents and purposes, the same height. But the scale difference and the overt contemporaneity is very important to this district and on this site. So with that, George, pass this on to you.
Okay. So the right and left, right?
That goes forward on the right, yeah. And there's a pointer on the top.
So as Harry indicated, we wanted to make a...
George,
George Schiefedecker, BKSK Architects. Let me take a step backward. You have in front of you a handout, and in each case we've given you the previous proposal on the left-hand side and our new proposal on the right. I'll be skipping by the previous proposal pretty quickly to try to stick more closely to the current one. We wanted to make a contemporary composition with classic materials of the district, the brick and the brownstone, interwoven with some of more modern application of glass and metal in terms of back-of-hand panels and the use of thin thermally broken steel on the facade. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of that contemporary expression is that these triangular or trapezoidal sites along 7th Avenue do not lend themselves to plans that have symmetrical outcomes. And so it seems very appropriate, in fact, that a measure of contemporaneity is applied to them, because that is the sort of natural outgrowth of the plan, in the same way a more symmetrical or standard plan was resulted in many of the facades you see in the district. The major materials, obviously the brick, major piers at these points, and secondary piers that have a more random order to them. The brownstone in the sill of each floor, and also in a vertical piece at the entrance. And that's a classic pairing. That's something you see all through the district, and we like the notion that we would bring that into a more contemporary understanding of a building. We've maintained from our previous scheme a kind of metal cornice wrapper. I think it does a number of things. It's a little riff on the notion of cornice. It also establishes a scale to this building that is not about setbacks, which is a scale and a no setback volume or bulk that you see in almost all of the tenement buildings of 5 and 6 and 6.5 stories in this area. There's an additional element that is difficult to see, and I'll point it out in other renderings, where there is an asymmetrical use of a fin going vertically at some of these bays, so that there is both a brick return at some of these bays as well as a metal return. And we'll see that a little bit later. So there's an additional kind of randomness to the patterning as you run through it. And then, of course, there's glass, as there was before, and backpan glass, shadow boxes on the interior where necessary to provide additional privacy. Want to weave in the whole notion and discussion of height into this conversation as we talk about the building. And you'll see in the side-by-side renderings that we've positioned ourselves a little bit more to look down the street, and that's to understand very clearly that the buildings on this street, both in the westerly direction and behind us, are of the 5.5 to 6.5 story tenement buildings that have cornice heights anywhere from 61 feet right to our neighbors, on to heights of 74 feet down the block here, and in fact in back of us. So at 64 feet for the height of our cornice, having taken off the 7th floor, we think we were very much in context with the balance of the area. Approaching the building from the south, just quickly again about height. Gourmet Garage on the diagonally across from us has been approved at Landmarks for a 75-foot high street wall and 85-foot overall height. It has a 1-story building on one side. It has a 2-story parking garage on the other. Our building, again, at that 64-foot cornice height, measures very similarly to a tenement building down north of us, and what we call the Witch's Hat a little bit further to the north.
Use a moment.
One of the things that you commented on previously and was that this, our previous architecture was very vertical, and you asked for a little bit more balance to the facade. I think that verticality is most evident in this view, so I wanted to bring it up here. So we have created a frame out of the brick of varying depth spandrels, a slightly smaller depth spandrel in the center, and a deeper spandrel to the sides. Substantial depth to that frame, 10 inches back to the glass in most areas, about 4 inches back to the brownstone at the sills. And as I said before, now you can begin to see the effect of the metal fins occurring at points on the facade, not everywhere. And in addition, a kind of bay window where the glass is brought out to the face of the brick at the center of the facade. Again, this is the old massing up in here, well, I've mentioned the heights as we go down the avenue or up the avenue. Distant view from the north. On the avenue, you do often get, or occasionally get, a much taller scale, which is obviously a building like that, 126 feet. But the buildings that are being built now, the buildings that are filling in and repairing the context of 7th Avenue South as it was cut through the existing framework, the existing context, tend to be at the height that we are now, as well as those 6-story tenement buildings that I've mentioned before. Getting closer to our building, one of the things that you've requested of us was specifically to address a condition that happens many times in this district, where you get triangular or trapezoidal sites, the sidewalls are very often much more in evidence. And you asked for more detail on that sidewall and more consideration of it relative to neighbors to the north, as well as the visual view of the building from the street. So obviously we've carried some aspects of the frame slightly around the corner so that it kind of melds or dissipates as it approaches the sidewall. There are brownstone sills that reoccur at the windows. There is a sort of solarium type space that continues all the way top to bottom of the building now, and gives that sense of kind of typical Greenwich Village greenhouse, and brings the metal and glass vocabulary from the front to the back. The center of the block remains, or is at present, a fairly compromised donut. There are already three-story, two-story buildings within that center. And we have and continue to have our building set back at its north-west corner. And then there are additional setbacks, and most prominently the reduction by one floor as it faces into the center. In the center of the block, I think the most prominent thing is the elimination again of the 7th floor, so that, that 7th floor obviously had most of its volume pushed to the back corner, so a substantial reduction by 10 feet of that. What we mentioned before, the vocabulary, the solarium running up and down, the continuation of some of the details around the side, and the general reduction of bulk on the back of the building. The view from Charles Street, looking back into the center of the block, again, reduction of the bulk at the 7th floor. The darker volumes you're seeing here are the building actually on Christopher Street that's beyond our building. So hopefully a substantially reduced impact on its view into the center. I wanted for a moment, if I may, just to skip back to one view, realizing I've forgotten to say something. We mentioned how the triangular configuration of these sites results in an opportunity at the point, the sort of flat iron effect. And it was an earlier comment by the commissioners on a previous scheme that had been ignored. What we've tried to do and what we continue to do from the previous scheme is emphasize that, work with it, make it a more celebratory point in our architecture. Our entrance is here, the canopy extension is there, a bit of canopy coming there, the brownstone vertical piece running all the way up and down the side and into the entry of our building. All efforts to take advantage of that architectural opportunity. The materials of our building. I think one of the, we start with the combination of the brick and the brownstone, and I think that one of the things that's always interesting to me is in the classic buildings of the area, that combination. And we would like to use salvaged brownstone, and we've been working at sourcing that. There are substitutes that are closely resembling it, and I have one here in hand. But I think one of the most important things, actually, about the contrast between the two is to get a fairly sort of bright molded brick out of it, so that the contrast is more evident. As you walk around, I think that architects of the past worked hard to get contrast between the two materials as opposed to having them meld together. So that's one of the things we were trying to do with our choice of brick. The metal is very simply a sort of deeper gray tone, and then at the top a zinc. And in the back pan panels, we would carry that zinc in behind it in the shadow box effect. And at the base, a simple gray granite that's got some bits of red and white running through it. Champlain granite comes from upstate New York.
That be the finish on the granite?
Yes, it would, yeah. Thank you. So in terms of the details, as we walk around the building, at the middle of, at the middle of the building and the center, there is the steel and glass, thermally broken, thin profiled steel above brownstone, set flush with the brick. Immediately adjacent to that, we have the deeper recesses that show the frame. Brownstone sill, thin profile, steel and glass above that. And at times those are backhand and at times they are clear. Here you can see a brick, a metal fin as it's expressed on the facade. Those happen on one side of a bay. On the other side, we would have a simple brick return. And you'll see that in some of the images as well. I think if you look closely, you'll see it in this one on your handouts. At the top, we have the two-part cornice running, and the wrapper portion is sort of the lower portion. This piece sort of visually continues around the building, ends up in the cornice and the canopy at the bottom, comes back around and down at the base at the entrance.
Is that zinc? Is that where
So
the
that
zinc
would
is
just
used?
be working, that'd be metal, yeah.
So where's the zinc used?
The zinc is up in these panels and down at the lower fill-in panels here, and in behind the glass at the backhand or shadow box panels. At the commercial storefronts, obviously the display glass brought forward with a deep recess back to a fascia that houses the louver and allows for signage die cut at the front, and gives this very prominent reading because of its depth. The stone base that we were mentioning previously. At the entry, we've taken the party wall of the adjacent building, put our brick on it, registered their floor locations as an additional kind of architectural detail, put the sign for our building as an outgrowth of those sort of metal channels. They don't show metal here, but they should. The brownstone coming down vertically from the top, turning the corner into the lobby, and the wrapper, as I said, starting here, coming around, and finishing at the canopy as well. So those are the elements of our design. We have a height analysis that if there continues to be concerns with our height, we hope that we could run through it or have opportunity to discuss that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, George, very much. Any further questions or anything more on the height? I know it's in here, it's covered, and you've implicitly addressed it in your presentation, and I think the reduction, as shown, is the way to go, and is an appropriate way. Anything more to add? We'll get right to discussion. Fred.
Well, I've used this word only a few times in my 5+ years of being on this commission, but I think this is thrilling. It's a really interesting, even more clever than the last time, but better, much better.
Clever is good.
Really, and it puts the lie to what I said in the last applicant about context buildings being okay if they're just okay, they fill in. Somehow, it's not okay to just fill in on this site. you know, as was made clear, 7th Avenue, like Houston Street, was widened, leaving all this scar tissue to be developed over the last 50, 60, 70 years, and it's only been in the last decade or so that the values of these properties have risen to such a degree in our hyperventilating city these days that it makes sense to develop these odd pieces of real estate. The healing process is going on very well now, I think, in this block along 7th Avenue. The reduction of the floor height, the 7th floor, was just absolutely necessary, and I think it proves how beneficial it was to have done that. And then what you've done, this freeing up and letting an individual creative force here be influenced heavily by the context, the materials, the height, but then not in any way the form of the building being a slavish imitation of anything around it, which I think is appropriate for 7th Avenue and is clearly in the hands of real pros here. What else to say about it? I think there are two ways of going about building a good building in a historic context here, a new building. One is you kind of accept the materials of the surrounding context and do something interesting with the form, and I think that's what's been done here. The other, of course, is to accept a classic form of what you find and modifying the materials in some contemporary way. And we see both examples of that around this table frequently. This is the former of those two options, and I think it's just handled really so well in all of its aspects. The detailing is highly inventive and interesting. The first floor retail spaces should be extraordinarily interesting. The level of glass and interplay back and forth is, I think, just terrific.
Well, not to offend the Witch's Hat building, but when I compare the two in my own head, the two words that come to mind for me are exciting and genius, and the third word is thoughtful. I cannot imagine a better building for this site, and I thank you for making the changes that you made. This is a remarkable building, and as a New Yorker, I thank you for this building.
Joan?
I agree with a lot of those comments, and my notes, for the first one is richness and high quality of the design and of the materials. And then the second one is sensitive design, which is modern, but also respects the fabric of the historic district. And I think you've done all that, and rather than repeat everything that my colleagues have said, I can support this, and I love it. I think it's perfect for this area and for this site. Congratulations.
Michael?
Well, I think it is a great improvement over the last project. I guess being familiar with the work of the applicant firm, I'm less enthralled than I might otherwise be. I don't think I think that it for me feels a bit familiar, the use of the kind of undulating wall trope as a device. But I think it's effective. I think it's certainly appropriate. I think the detailing's fantastic. For me, the thing that feels weirdest to me about it, and again, it's not something that would prevent me from voting for it, but that might be worth exploring, is the building looks to me like an ABA kind of building. We have a masonry wing on the left, a masonry on the right, and this kind of glass bay window in the center. And for me, it feels that articulation feels half-hearted with these little kind of stripes of the brick going across. And I would just suggest that, in looking at other buildings in the district where you have that kind of tripartite arrangement, there's a greater kind of commitment to the difference between the wings and the center, and I think that would not hurt the building to explore it, but it doesn't really affect its approvability. And you couldn't get a better contrast between this project and the last to really show that this building is sincerely attempting to contribute to the ongoing discourse of architecture in the city, I'm proud to be able to participate in its approval and in its example for other applicants.
Okay, Marjorie?
Yeah, so thanks. BKSK, I referred to them in that last application, kind of longing for the same kind of understanding that these architects have for historic districts and the appreciation of studying the materials and then learning how to blend materials and proportions into a contemporary project, which they've done yet again. And so there was certain things that really struck me as being particularly successful, and it's sort of odd because I don't normally say that about sort of the side of the building, but I actually think that is that the south-facing side of the building that turns with this interesting kind of jumble with the greenhouse and so on. It's making a really great sort of reference and a bow to the interior court. And it's actually a very attractive collection that I think actually in a certain way the vocabulary of the whole building is a collection of a little bit of the history of the cacophony of the 7th Avenue cut through. So, I mean, if you just look at the adjoining buildings and lots of other places where the avenue cut through, there's all of these remnants. And so this rhythm on the facade almost refers to the remnants where there isn't sort of the regularity that you would expect on other kinds of streets. And I think that's terrific and necessary in terms of kind of a reminder of where we've been on 7th Avenue. And I also think that the use of brownstone as an infill panel, that's actually very interesting with the metal wrap, and hopefully will protect the edges in a way that another project we saw doesn't. My only comment is actually in terms of, continuing to work on this and so on, but at staff level, is that I don't think that the central bay that's left open actually works well with that whole dialogue that's going on the two sides, that if it were knitted together, I think it would feel less corporate at the center. It actually feels corporate to me there, and I'm not sure why the weaving, why the knitting stopped. But I think it's a great project.
Okay, Diana?
Yeah, I think it's really a real contribution to the district as it is now presented. And everything that's been done, like lowering it to fit in, has made it fit in better. It's created a much more interesting building by using them and the masonry and brick and brownstone and the spandrels to create more horizontality. And instead of just using, as was previously, the colors of glass to create more interest. I think all of these things have really made it a terrific project, and it's got a much better proportion of solid to void, and it just overall is so much more contextual, but at the same time, a really interesting new building in the district that I think will hold its own very, very well, and I'm very pleased with it.
I think that, all of the words I was going to use, it is exciting, it's contextual, it's contemporary, but I think it's better because of our comments, and actually interpreting our comments in a way that made it better. So they took what they had and they made a building that's more appropriate and more contextual and just, I think, a better neighbor. But I do agree with some other commissioner comments about the central bay, because I think that the building is almost like, it looks more freeform and not so symmetrical until you get to the bay window, which I think tries to make it too classical, and that maybe that should be left.
Okay, good. I agree with everything that's been said here, and right direction has been taken on this building from its earliest incarnation up to today in all of its elements. So congratulations to the team, and it's extremely important that buildings like this continue to get built, and please get it built. in historic districts, and where appropriate and carefully defined cases, there is a demolition of what is existing for these in these narrow series of cases, and in the best case, it's replaced by something like this. So with that, we'll close the hearing. Motion and a second. Marjorie, please.
In the matter of a certificate of appropriateness for 137th Avenue South in the Greenwich Village Historic District, the application is to demolish the existing building and to construct a new building. I recommend approval, finding that because most portions of the facade and storefronts have been replaced over time, the facade does not presently feature any extant 1930s fabric. That's with respect to the existing building. That the existing building is not one for which the Greenwich Village Historic District was designated. Therefore, the proposed demolition will not eliminate a significant protected historic feature of the street, the block, or the Greenwich Village Historic District. That the proposed building is of a height and massing that will relate well to the varied scale and geometry of the buildings on 7th Avenue South, which is characterized by buildings of very different sizes and scales on unusually shaped lots that were created when 7th Avenue cut through the street grid. That the proposed layering of materials, planes, and architectural elements acknowledges the eclecticism of the streetscape. That the overall composition and palette of brick, brownstone, and glass material is richly conceived and will complement the varied character of 7th Avenue South. That the presence of storefronts at the ground floor is consistent with the commercial character of 7th Avenue South. That the size and scale of the proposed storefront openings will relate well to the historic storefronts on this street and in the adjacent blocks. That the proposed canopy at the recessed entrance to the residential portion of the building will be consistent with the contemporary design of the building and the commercial character of 7th Avenue South. That the use of brick and brownstone will recall historic buildings in this historic district. That the use of brick for the new cladding proposed for the south wall, where the building abuts the adjacent 19th century structure at West 10th Street, will create a discrete connection and transition between this 21st century building and the 19th and early 20th century buildings on West 10th Street. That setting the upper floor and bulkheads back from the street wall will help to reduce the apparent mass of the building. That the proposed secondary courtyard facades with brick cladding, balcony setbacks, and punched windows will respond to the secondary facades of the early 20th century masonry apartment buildings and row houses on the surrounding lots, and will not create an overwhelming wall across the courtyard, and that for these reasons, the proposed building will relate well to the streetscape and the Greenwich Village Historic District.
Second, all in favor? Aye, opposed? It's approved. Thank you. Thank you, all team. Thank you. Okay.